Welcome to our viewers. We'd like to thank you for joining us for our second installment of our MythBusters series. Today's topic is, are all ransomware protection solutions the same? Presenting today is Amit Rawlani. Amit is the Director of Technology, Alliances and Solutions Management at Cloudian.
Thank you so much, Laura. Appreciate that warm welcome and introduction. We've been running these MythBusters now for the last few weeks, and this is part 2 of our series. And over here, we're going to focus on ransomware. We're calling this the Ransomware Protection Edition of the MythBusters series, right? As apparent from the title, this series of webinars discusses specific myths that surround technology and may sometimes result in imperfect or, at worst, incorrect solutions. So here today we're going to talk about why do you even need to care about ransomware protection, what kind of solutions have we seen in the marketplace, and what are some of the typical follies that you guys should be avoiding when implementing these solutions in your organizations. So before we begin, let's talk about data, right? Even in these times, data is getting generated everywhere. In fact, more so than it was even 3 months back. There's research data from universities, pharmaceuticals. I'm sure virology is one of the top research topics for all the universities and research institutions out there. Gene sequencing, trying to figure out what is happening with these viruses and organisms. Everything is generating data. Going into your enterprise setting, right? Zoom videos, working online with Google Suite, Google Documents, Office 365, all of these are in full flow and generating even more data. Digital is the reality today. Image and media, videos of people working from home, trying to interface with their colleagues and so on and so forth. Security and surveillance still remains a pretty big data generator. And then, of course, backing up all of these valuable assets. All of this is data getting generated a lot more in the exabyte range today. So the challenge with all of this is most of this data, if not all, is business critical. Organizations that deal and utilize this important asset will be better positioned for business success, not just now, but in the coming days and future. The challenge for most of the organization, therefore, is to manage and store this critical asset that they can utilize to create insights, make business decisions, and so on and so forth. And the data is growing so rapidly. As you can see in this chart, I'm sure all of you guys have seen this multiple times in various different presentations, but how do you effectively create solutions to manage this data? That is the fundamental challenge of our digital world today. Cloud absolutely has to be part of the solution, but cloud is not just public cloud. We're talking about on-prem, private clouds, public clouds, hybrid clouds. Everything together is going to be part of the solution. You are going to have data that straddles your data centers with the public cloud. And based on that, you will have situations where your data needs protection. Your data definitely needs protection, not just from one particular threat. There is the internal threats. There is things like accidental deletion. What happens when employees accidentally delete business critical data? How do you retrieve those? Malicious insiders creating havoc between different organizations, BUs within organizations, and so on and so forth. Retaliation between employees, evidence tampering when you have critical information for compliance reasons or for reasons like audit trailing and so on and so forth. How do you protect your data against regular data loss prevention? And this is the need of every organization, and everybody is well aware that you have to take measures to protect your business critical assets in this digital age. Beyond the internal threats, you also have external threats. most of our conversation after this is going to be focused on the external threats. These threats range from malware to hackers to rogue apps and ransomware, of course. Ransomware specifically is the fastest growing malware threat that you have in the market today. This particular malware is a type of malware that takes over your entire computer systems and will lock you out of your own data and systems, rendering the source data as well as the backup data useless where it resides. Typically, these hackers and these ransomware attackers will hold your data for ransom, and the payments are demanded in untraceable cryptocurrencies. Your data is either locked up, encrypted, or it is deleted with a copy being with the hackers, so that unless you pay the ransom, you do not have access to your own data and your business is brought to its knees. It is a pretty real and challenging threat. It is the fastest growing malware threat out there today, and we've seen multiple government agencies raising red flags about the growing threat of ransomware. Why does it matter even more today? Well, ransomware strikes within every minute across the globe today. In fact, not only across the globe, within the United States or North America, you will see ransomware strikes in a matter of minutes every minute or minute. If you look at just the last couple of months, you will see headlines ranging from Russian attackers that took down North Carolina City and the county government systems. Multiple reports of coronavirus being used as clickbait to infiltrate systems and execute ransomware attacks. There are heartbreaking reports of hospitals and labs that are on the front line of the fight against COVID that get targeted. These critical infrastructure for healthcare do not have the time or the bandwidth to be out of commission, so they end up paying ransom without even having a chance to fight it. Even the WHO testing labs was attacked. The hackers are ruthless. And if you look at our government agencies, the CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency of the DHS, has even issued an alert, AA20099A, which specifically calls out COVID-19 exploitation by cyber actors which are malicious and will hold you for ransomware. So it is a current and real threat where you need a solution for your organization, whether it is big, medium, or small. It can be anybody that can get attacked. And remember, if you are a small to medium organization and you think that you are not going to get attacked, well, guess what? Hackers look for organizations like yourselves because they know that your security systems may not be as sophisticated as the bigger enterprises. So everybody is a target for ransomware, whether it's big or small, and it is a real threat today. Now, coming to the topic at hand, let's discuss some of the myths that are associated with ransomware solutions that you could implement within your organization to protect yourself against this malice. So the first myth that I'm going to cover is that a solution is a solution. I have talked to multiple vendors and somebody has a ransomware solution, or I have implemented my ransomware solution in a particular way and all ransomware solutions are built the same. Let's get into some of the current ransomware protection mechanisms that we've seen in the marketplace, and then we'll try to dissect each of them and see what the efficacy of each of them is and if they're actually the same. So the first one that we've seen is people just don't have any implementation of a ransomware protection solution. Their retort is, it just won't happen to me. I'm not big enough, or I am not. I don't have data that's critical for hackers or ransomware attackers. Well, we attended a session with a security session just about 6 months back before COVID, and one of the speakers over there was an FBI analyst, and he asked a room filled of CIOs of companies from across the country, and the question was, which of you do you have been attacked or dealt with the threat of ransomware over the past year? About 20% of the hands went up. He then turned to the remaining 80% and said, well, 90% of you that have not raised your hands have been attacked, and you just don't know this. In today's parlance, about 80% of the organizations are asymptomatically ransomware penetrated, so to speak. It is the top 5 risk to the world economy, according to the World Economic Forum in 2019. There are more than 4,000 attacks happening per day, and this was a statistic that US FBI released in 2016. It's a lot more today. 97% of these attacks have seen increase. There has been a 97% increase of these attacks over the last couple of years. And 51% of the attacked companies have started paying ransom. Cost to businesses have been in the billions of dollars. Estimations range anywhere from 8 to 12 billion in 2018 itself. And the average cost, and this is the interesting part, the average cost of each attack is 133,000 US dollars. Now remember, when hackers attack big companies and hold them for ransomware, think about the likes of the Sonys of the world, or a county, Atlanta County. They extract in excess of 10 to $50 million. And when you talk about average being 133, you're really talking about the spread of this, the cost of the cost of the attack ranges very, very broadly. So the average of 133 means it can start at the low spectrum and it can go to the really, really high spectrum. So anybody can be attacked. Very important to realize that. The next kind of implementation that we see is, I use backup, and backup is the best defense. Typically, you're right. Backup has been the best defense against ransomware. If you have a clean copy, typically you are able to recover from, or typically you have been able to recover from attacks. But in today's world, the hackers are getting more and more sophisticated. They have to jump across various security features, robust firewalls, but your systems are only as tight as the weakest link in the chain. And all it needs is one person in the organization to fall for a clickbait and the hackers are in. Now, with the sophistication of the hackers, you know, and they are aware that the backups are one of the ways that enterprises are protecting themselves against ransomware. So the backup storage is now become one of the primary targets, along with the primary storage, for sophisticated hackers to implement a ransomware attack. Once the data is attacked in the backups systems as well, the organization can be brought to the knees. So by itself, backup is not the best solution. You need more than just a backup solution. And we'll get into some of the details of what it means to have an immutable backup as well. The next one is, we've seen high backup to tapes. Tape backups have been traditionally the way to have an offline copy which can be retrieved in the event of disaster or something like a ransomware attack. Well, tape is a whole different conversation. In fact, I have a myth specifically dedicated for tape, and I'll get into the details of that at that level. But suffice to say, those of us who have been in the storage industry long enough and have had the privilege, and I use the term loosely, of working with tape, know the pitfalls and the challenges of working with tape, specifically with the retrieval or the difficulty of retrieval of data from tapes. Any solution that you have that is so protected that it becomes difficult to retrieve is not a solution at all. So tape solutions, not so much for ransomware protection. And then finally, we've seen a lot of proprietary solutions for immutability around various storage and backup vendors. Many of the data protection vendors offer ransomware protection solutions based on their own backup software paired with their own storage boxes or bricks, as they like to call it. And it's not really standard-based. And typically what happens is it tends to lock you into the products from an end-to-end perspective. You have to use the same backup software with their own storage solution. Typically what happens is with these solutions you end up hitting a wall when the products need to be more scalable, more economical, you want to move to the cloud, or you want more versatility, and so on and so forth. What a good solution for ransomware protection should look like and should be is, one, of course, it needs to be implemented. You need to have a solution. Hope is not a strategy. Backup by itself is not also a right solution. You need to have data that's not vulnerable when it's backed up. Tape is not a solution. You need a modern and accessible solution which is easy to retrieve in the case of a ransomware attack. And it needs to be based on open and industry standards. So with that, what we can say is the idea that all solutions that claim to be ransomware protection solutions are the same is not true. This myth is definitely busted. Let's go on to the next myth. The second myth that we're going to talk about today is tape, right? Tape is a good solution for data immutability. It gives you offline and a resource that can typically not be attacked by ransomware, and so on and so forth. Well, let's get into the details of that. So yes, traditionally tape has been a means of protecting against data loss and attacks from external threats. But the pitfalls and challenges of tape start and end with the accessibility of data on tape. It is cumbersome, to say the least. It's usually a physical process to retrieve data that has been stored on tape. And you have to bring the tape back, load it onto a reader. It can mean a matter of days and weeks to retrieve lost data. Now imagine the situation where your organization has been attacked with ransomware. They've given you a matter of 3 days to respond to the attackers with whether you're going to pay the ransom or not. And you are struggling to figure out what tape, where the backup is, and how do you retrieve it quickly enough to make sure that the data is still accessible in the tape that you had stored a couple of years back. So accessibility and the failure to retrieval really makes tape not a good target for a time-bound attack like a ransomware attack. The next issue is corruption. Tapes tend to get corrupt. If you're going to dump data on a tape and store it in a vault for 3 years, what happens if it gets corrupted? And we know that they do get corrupt. If you have a mechanical arm that's used for retrieval, sometimes you can have jams in the mechanical arm. You can have magnetic tape, they can get demagnetized, and so on and so forth. You have to check from time to time to ensure that you actually have your asset in a protected format. For in case of any eventuality, it will be useful to you. The process of retrieval and checking of this data veracity is again cumbersome. And again, you're really going back to the accessibility of data issue, which is really making this not a great solution. The third issue is tape technology by itself, and it updates every so often, and you need multiple assets for tape retrieval. You have a tape medium, and then you have tape automation, and then of course you have tape readers, right? So what happens when your tape reader or your tape medium is on LTFS 6 and your tape reader, now you've upgraded your infrastructure and it's on tape 8, LTFS 8, and when you start actually reading it, there happens to be incompatibility between the two. Well, oftentimes when newer versions come in, you will have to go and recode the data that was put on the previous tape. So just to make sure that there's compatibility. I mean, I'm not saying it's always incompatibility situation, you have to keep recoding. So again, it is not the best scenario where you have data that's been put in for a disaster or a eventuality like ransomware, and you are not even sure that you can retrieve the data. I'll end with this. Data not accessible or data not retrievable is data not protected. So with that, we come to what does it mean to have a modern system which is based on standards that can get you close to being immutable, like tape used to be at one point, right? Or tape used to be considered to be at one point. So here we'll quickly talk about the de facto standards that's quickly being adopted to get immutability or protection for data as much as you get from tape, but keeping it online all the time. And this is based on the concept of worm storage, which is worm stands for write once and read many. And typically, this is implemented with cloud storages using now S3 object lock, and that's quickly becoming the de facto standard. This is something that AWS S3 released about 12 to 18 months back, and is being adopted by the industry as one of the best ways to make your data immutable. It applies to object storage system and goes to the granularity of the object. So you can lock data and unlock data at the granularity of the lowest granularity that's possible in an object storage system. Right? Objects are made immutable in this case. By immutable, we mean tamper-proof or unchangeable or not deletable for a certain period of time. Now, who defines this time? Well, you define the time by yourself, and this is the parameter you put in at the time you create the bucket to make it immutable. So by itself, the S3 object lock is a great technology that is giving you the modern way of doing immutable data as you would with tape, and that makes for a better solution than tape. You actually have multiple different modes of protection with object lock, and that comes with governance mode, which is really a testing mode, or it's really about making sure you have protection inter-department and so on and so forth. For ransomware protection, there is the compliance mode, which is a stringent mode of locking up data, so much so that even your root access cannot delete or tamper with the data, exactly like you would have your data in a write once or a ROM medium, write only memory type of, you remember those kind of details, that kind of a medium. So with that, we can definitely say the myth about tapes being the best medium for data immutability and ransomware protection is busted, because they're definitely a lot better, modern, and more accessible mediums which actually protect you and enable you to retrieve or recover out of disasters like ransomware attacks than tape. And let's go to the third myth with this. And the third myth that we are going to address today is, well, we just talked about S3 Object Lock API, or for that matter, a software-based approach to a data immutability. Is that sufficient to provide you data immutability? So to address that, let's first see what Forrester says is the technologies that you need for creating a proper ransomware solution, ransomware protection solution. From their perspective, there are four major technologies, and for our conversation, it really comes down to being able to implement an immutable file system with an underlying worm storage. So we talked a little bit about worm storage, and the question really at this point is S3 Object Lock enough to give you worm functionality? And you will see quite a lot of storage solutions coming up with S3 Object Lock based solutions, which are implemented in software. I mean, it's a software feature. You do get more and more vendors coming in to implement it. Cutting to the chase, it is not enough to have storage locking down objects with S3 Object Lock by itself. What happens if a rogue actor can get into your systems? I mean, remember, we're talking about sophisticated hackers. And then if they can get root access all the way down to the storage level, or the OS level for that matter, and completely compromise your storage system, which holds an S3 Object Lock data. Now, if your storage system is compromised at the root level, you can imagine that the hacker will copy out the data and completely delete the storage software, and then the S3 Object Lock is for naught, right? You actually have specific requirements by regulatory bodies pointing this feature out, right? So if you look at U.S. security regulations around what constitutes as worms-enabled storage, you have SEC Rule 17A4, which specifies that even a root access should not be able to delete data from storage systems that need to be considered worm. You have FINRA Rule 4511, you have CFTC Rule 1.31, and similarly, you have European standards which come from Germany and Switzerland, which talk about similar kind of requirements to be considered as a worm storage. So just by implementing S3 Object Lock, it's not enough to say that I have S3 Object Lock and your data will be protected if you put it under S3 Object Lock with me. You really need a secure and hardened system for that, with features like secure shell, integrated firewall, access controls, and you need to be able to guarantee that even a root access to the system will not be given in terms of a worm mode, so that your data is really, really protected. That's where things like certifications come into play. You look at third-party vendors that actually go just government certified to go and assess different storage platforms for worm compliance, and one of those is Quest Associates, which does detailed analysis of systems that claim to be worm. So the myth that just having a software feature like S3 Object Lock by itself gives you data immutability and ransomware protection is busted as well. With that, I'm going to quickly introduce to you the Cloudian Hyperstore flagship product, which gives you all of these great features that will enable you to keep your data under lock and key, and is certified by government regulatory organizations to be a worm certified storage system. So Cloudian is on-prem object storage system, which is 100% S3 compatible. It is natively built on the S3 API, surfaces all the S3 compatible workloads. And the core capability of Hyperstore is to store unstructured data in the exabyte scalability range. With Hyperstore, customers can start small, as low as 3-node systems, and scale into the hundreds of petabytes, into the exabytes. Has support for all the major public and private clouds and is ideal for a hybrid cloud deployment. It does offer software-only mode. It also has compliance mode and appliance and a consumption model for deployment. The main use case for Hyperstore are data protection with ransomware protection and compliance. One of the biggest use cases, because Hyperstore implements S3 object lock natively within its S3 APIs, and it is certified immutable or worm compliant by the government entities. In fact, it is DoD level certified for worm storage. Quickly getting into the flow of how you would go and set up ransomware protection workflow within with Cloudian Hyperstore. Well, as with any data protection workflow, you would start with a data backup solution or a data protection solution, like whether it's a Veeam, Rubrik, Veritas, or Commvault. You would start by making sure that you have created an object lock bucket within Cloudian and make that as the target for the backup workflow. Once that is done, your backup softwares will create the data backup workflow that lands into this object lock bucket, and the data in this is now worm compliant, and it can be only read. You can write to it once, but after that it is completely immutable for the time duration that you've specified. It is so stringent that we require our clients to actually have a separate worm license so that they're aware that they're implementing a very stringent lock on their data, and they should make sure that it is the right use case for that. Once that is done, even if you're attacked, your data is not it's tamper-proof, so to speak. And in case of an attack, you can retrieve your data from a clean copy of your data in a matter of minutes. You don't have to wait for hours or weeks or months to see if your data is even retrievable as you would in other solutions. So it is a complete solution for ransomware protection, and specifically with Veeam, because Veeam also with V10 of their release also supports S3 object lock. So it's an end-to-end S3 object lock based solution, and it is seamless for you guys. With other vendors, it works as well. It just needs one extra step of creating the specific parameters on Cloudian itself. With that, quickly, I'm going to leave you guys with why customers choose Cloudian. It is our highest S3 API compatibility. It is the start small and grow. Object lock and immutable storage specifically for ransomware and compliance use cases is a big differentiator. You will not find a certified solution in the object storage space on-prem as even halfway close to what Cloudian offers. And all of this comes in at a cloud-like cost of less than half a cent per gig per month.
Thank you, Amit. Yeah, statistics plainly show ransomware is a clear and present danger. So this information is extremely valuable to help audiences really understand the differences between the ransomware protection solutions out there, and what features they should be looking for to address the threat. So thank you so much for all this information. So our first question is, are your solutions focused on a specific sized company, i.e. for large or mid-sized but not small?
Sure. So I can answer that. Cloudian Hyperstore is specifically a capacity storage system. So we have storage requirements that start with 3 nodes. 3 nodes is the minimum configuration. So you're looking at really 100 terabyte as a starting point raw use case. So 50 terabytes usable, 100 terabytes would be the place where you would start looking at Cloudian Hyperstore as a solution. The other way to use Cloudian is a consumption model. So we have Cloudian available through multiple MSP customers as well as VCPPs, which is VMware Cloud Provider partners that offer Cloudian under the hood for all of the use cases that we talked about, whether it's ransomware protection or backup as a service, or even just storage as a service. You could use all the great features that we just talked about around ransomware protection through these MSPs in that range. But if you have data storage needs which straddle around 50 terabytes and more, yes, Cloudian can support you. So I would say medium to large. We don't typically go around the small-sized business directly.
Okay, great. And how is the data protected from rogue or disgruntled administrators or administrator? Is
Right.
that a myth?
Yeah. So it's it's a myth in some cases, and this goes back to the third myth actually, where we talked about if you actually have software-based solutions and you have an administrator with root access, they can pretty much go and do whatever they want with the software, right? And we're talking about system administrators. So even if you lock your storage with features, if they have access all the way down to the OS, it can be easily tampered with. Well, with Hyperstore, we ship, when you specifically get it in worm mode, we ship with secure shell and blocked root access, right? And we make sure that the customers are aware that you are getting it in the worm mode, so your root access will be blocked. The system is verified compliant for non-rewritable and non-erasable storage requirements from the SEC 17A4 requirement. They're the most stringent ones out there, and we are certified for that. This certification took us almost 2 years to get, as well as multiple iterations of software development, practices, processes, and coding standards. And we are pretty much the only ones right now in the object storage space that is certified for that. So even if you have a disgruntled employee or an administrator with root access that you fired, or for whatever reason they are malicious enough to try and go and delete it, if it's in the worm mode and you have the data locked up for, let's say, 30 days, they're not going to be able to do anything with that data for 30 days. So that is really, at least with Cloudian, it's a myth. With other vendors, we've seen vendors talking about S3 object lock being implemented by them, but they are software implementation or virtualized implementations, which pretty much means you can go into the root layer and delete the data even if it is under S3 object lock. So it's a myth for some vendors. With Cloudian, it is not a myth. You can actually protect your data against disgruntled employees, administrators.
Okay, another one about worm. Let's see, you spoke about protecting the data with an immutable file system and worm storage. But with worm storage, the data is still readable, ergo sensitive data can be stolen by hackers that get into the system. How does your solution protect against that?
That's a good question, and that's really a security question. It's not a ransomware protection is part of security, but it's a different level of security, right? Safeguarding sensitive customer information or sensitive information in general is not just good practice, but in a lot of regulated industries is also a requirement, whether it's healthcare requirement with HIPAA or financial FINRA requirements, which need for you to make sure that your PII information, personally identified information, is protected. With object lock, your data is readable, so that's not the solution you would use to protect your PII, right? That is after the fact, where you want to make sure that your data cannot be tampered to bring your business down. That's when you would use object lock. For the PII protection, Cloudian Hyperstore actually provides extensive suite of security features that make it possible to deploy and operate cost-effective storage that adheres to a lot of these stringent requirements around PII. Features like secure connection for data in flight, right? SSL connectivity to all of these apps, whether they're backup or other apps, data moving apps. So we require secure connection, or we do provide for ways to do secure connection, HTTPS connection or SSL connectivity. For data in rest on Cloudian, we support AES 56 server-side encryption. So once the data is encrypted, stored in encrypted format, it is, even if your hackers can read the data, unless they have the key, which they won't, there's no way for them to access it. And of course, shipping with secure shell, with role-based access controls, and extensive audit trail logging, your data can be made secure. The problem really comes in the implementation. I mean, you can have the most security feature-rich storage system like Cloudian is, but if your administrator does not enable server-side encryption or encryption at rest, we've seen in the case of, for example, some credit card companies, you've seen them store passwords in plain text, and hackers get in, and if they can read the data, they will. So it really comes down, that question really it comes down to implementation. But with Hyperstore, you can implement a fully secure system that is going to help you prevent even loss of PII, even in the case of hackers getting into your system. So a completely robust system which can help you with PII security as well as ransomware protection, making sure your data is tamper-proof as well.
Thank you, Amit. That's actually time for today. We're 1 minute over. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. So this will conclude our webinar today. Thank you to our audience for joining us.